Hey, folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. We have a special guest on our show this time who is a frequent guest on the channel. And we have a long history together. You know him for many years, almost since the inception of Beatlefan magazine, being a writer for them back in the 80s and 90s on my radio show on WDHA in New Jersey. He was a frequent guest along with Tom Frangione. Both this guest and Tom were recently on my show with Bruce Spizer. And he was my co-host for a few years on the podcast show, Things We Said Today. He turns up on this channel. He turns up on Things We Said Today every now and then. He turns up on Talk More Talk. He's kind of everywhere. And it's always great to welcome him back, Al Sussman. Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio.
Hi, Ken. Good to see you.
You know, in all the years that I've known you, we always talk about radio and you're growing up listening to the radio. And I always enjoy talking to people who are, shall we say, slightly older than me. I do have some vivid memories as a kid growing up in the 60s, hearing the Beatles on the radio. When I Want to Hold Your Hand broke, I was only 4.5 years old. And I just remember hearing wall-to-wall Beatles on the radio in 1964 with my little transistor radio pressed to my ear. But I don't have specific memories of when certain songs were premiered on the radio or certain albums. And that's why I want to turn to people like Al, which we will do from time to time here on the channel. I wanted to talk specifically about 1964 and quite possibly more about the first half of 1964, because as the charts guy, and anyone who's followed me in all my programs knows how often I quote the charts, the Billboard singles charts, the Billboard album charts. There was nothing at the time quite like that first half of 1964 and how the Beatles really dominated the charts. So I wanted to get Al's memories of that time. Specifically, why don't we, before we talk about that first half of 64. Do you recall the first time that you heard the Beatles at all on the radio?
Absolutely. In fact, this just came up very recently at the Fest for Beatles fans. We had a late night first generation fans panel on Saturday night. I think you had left by that point. And Wally Podrazik, who was moderating, asked us each to give our first memory of having heard the Beatles. And oddly enough, Mark Lapidus, who dropped in about halfway through the panel, gave a very similar reminiscence to mine, because he first heard I Want to Hold Your Hand on Scott Muni's show on WABC on Monday night, January 6th. I heard it approximately 24 hours later. I was at 14, was in 8th grade, and I'm ostensibly doing my homework, and I'm listening to Scott Muni's show on WABC, and the way his show was structured, they had an hour block of news from like ABC network news and features and things like that, from like 6 to 7:20. So then from 7:20 to 8 o'clock, Scott would play oldies. And then on Tuesday night, he would play, because that was New Survey Day on WABC, and he would play the top 7 songs. So, but during the oldies segment, he's mentioned something about a Beatles fan club. I thought, what the hell is that? and but I figured, hey, Dan Ingram has a Kemosabe club. Why not Scott Muni having a fan club about Beatles, meaning BEETLES. And so, didn't really think of any more of it. Then at 8 o'clock, he starts counting down the top 7. And he gets in, like all of kind of like the obvious sort of candidates for number 1 are, He's playing.
Mm.
It wasn't Louie Louie. It wasn't There I've Said It Again by Bobby Benton. It's not Forget Him by the just recently departed Bobby Rydell.
Mm.
And I'm thinking, what on earth could be the number one song? So gets to, the ever-present number one jingle on WABC. And on comes this record that I had never heard. And my original reaction was actually negative.
Uh-huh.
It was just so different. Actually, Mark had a very different reaction. He, hearing it 24 hours earlier, he bolted up. He was lying in bed and bolted up and said, "This is the greatest thing I've ever heard." It sounded so foreign from anything that we were kind of used to musically at that point. Right. That I just reacted negatively. I thought, who knows, what is this?
Right.
And so that was my introduction.
That's funny. I always remember me being the WABC person that I am. And one of my favorite DJs there was Ron Lundy. And he once said that the first time he heard the Beatles, they sounded like three Everly Brothers. So when you heard the Beatles, did you hear anything that was an influence from the past to you, like that with the harmonies? Did anything come to mind?
Not really, only because it was just so, because if you remember, both She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand are very different records from, say, Please Please Me or Love Me Do or From Me to You. They both had a bigger sound to it. And coming blasting out of a little tiny, transistor radio speaker, like I said, it sounded like something from Mars. It was very strange.
And at that point, the single for I Want to Hold Your Hand came out the end of December,
right,
of 63. So it took just 2 weeks to make number one in New York.
It was, well, let's see. WMCA played it, actually. They premiered it on December 26th, which was the same day that it was rush released, because in those days, nobody released anything on the day after Christmas.
Right.
And so they played it, and it made WABC survey the first week in, I think it was like the survey date was like December 31st. And it was, they just, a lot of times they would just give it just any number because they didn't really play all that many records. So I think they had it number 35. The next week, it's number one.
And in all that time, you never heard the record?
No. And Mark said the same thing. Mark had been in the Catskills over the Christmas holidays because his father was a band leader in the Catskills, and at that, in those days, getting the signals of New York stations in Sullivan County was pretty difficult. So he didn't hear any top 40 radio during the Christmas holidays. And I don't know why I hadn't been listening either, but I had never heard that record, and I hadn't heard anything about it.
It's interesting because so much is made of the fact that what great timing. By the time the Beatles came to America, by the time they were on the Ed Sullivan Show, they had the number one single in the country. But in New York, they already had it for a month.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, and as I said, to me, it was like, I didn't understand this. Just seemed to be coming out of nowhere, and yet in reality, it had been like a prairie fire because even during, well, obviously most people know the whole Carol James story about Marsha Albert, this girl from Silver Springs, Maryland, who had seen the Alexander Kendrick report on the Beatles on the CBS Evening News on December 10th, and wrote to Carol James, who was her favorite DJ, asking, can you play any music by this group? And he had a policy of kind of following up on fan mail like that. And so he, investigated into it and was able to get a copy of the, the Parlophone single of I Want to Hold Your Hand, had Marsha Albert up to the studio, I think on December 15th, and played it. And like in some, bad movie plot, the switchboard went crazy.
Yeah.
And then seeing that, he then sent copies of I Want to Hold Your Hand to friends of his at other radio stations, including the station that Ron Lundy was working at in St. Louis in those days. So that may have been when he first heard it. And it just kind of like took off like a prairie fire. But of course, in New York, they waited pretty much until the record was actually released by Capitol, and then in the first week in January, boom.
Now, just as a side note here, we all know that in '63 we had singles here in America that didn't go. Right. Or VJ released "Please Please Me" and "From Me to You," and Swan released "She Loves You," and we also know for a fact, "I Want to Hold Your Hand" was not the first song played in the United States from the Beatles.
Oh no.
Because Please Me, the fact that VJ was out of Chicago, the company, WLS played the song there, and it made their top 40. It was like around 35.
Yeah, well, Dick Biondi, who was the nighttime DJ there at the WLS, he became a very early champion of theirs because he was the one who originally played it. And then when he was kind of like exiled, WLS fired him a couple of months later, and he ended up in LA for a certain amount of time. And that summer he played "From Me to You." And so, but the airplay that it got in Chicago, there were a bunch of girls. Marty Edwards has written about this in her book, who formed a Beatles fan club. This is I think actually they formed the fan club probably like either the summer or fall of '63. So this is well before, things took off.
Yeah, and I remember Bruce Spizer writing about "She Loves You."
Yes.
Radio station in Massachusetts, but I can't remember where.
In Worcester. And in fact, Bruce was able to uncover a survey that had actually "I'll Get You" as the number one song, and I think "She Loves You" was number 2. Even though, again, in the rest of the country, hardly anybody knew about them at all.
It's fascinating because a lot of people think it all started with "I Want to Hold Your Hand." There were a few pockets in the United States where the Beatles got some action there on the radio.
Yeah, exactly. And in New York, actually, Scott Muni was really their first big champion in New York. There's over the years, because of all of Murray the K's self-promotion and the fact that he was able to get so much screen time in the Maysles Brothers film, and then later on, he in the film "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and all. I think people think that that he was responsible for them getting so much popularity, and that's completely wrong. It was Scott Muni who actually really because he really cared about the music more than say some of the other DJs even at WABC. And he was the one who started that fan club, and this is before the NEMS folks even got to New York, and and he really kind of believed in them. So I think, and this was at a time when I think people now, because of the fact that I think at any radio station now, it's the morning show that's the, kind of the anchor of the station. In those days, it was the nighttime DJ.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
His ratings these days are for morning drive.
Exactly.
By far.
Yeah. Right. In those days, now, even on the CHR stations, the nighttime DJs are not really all that important. It's the Elvis Durans, that have become the big deal because they do the morning shows.
It's also interesting to me that, well, obviously the Beatles broke big in the UK in '63, but in Canada, She Loves You was a #1 hit. And that came out before I Want to Hold Your Hand. So they caught on to the Beatles before us.
Yeah. So, very true. I think there were 2 albums that were released before. One of them was actually the basically just the Canadian replica of With the Beatles, because that actually was one of the first import that I ever got. Sometime in '64, I went into a record store in Hackensack, New Jersey, near where I lived at the time, and saw this album called Beetle Mania with the Beatles. And the songs on it, half of them were songs that had been on Meet the Beatles, but the other half were songs that were on the Beatles' second album, which at that point I still hadn't gotten. Mm-hmm. And so I got that, and it's an interesting album because it doesn't have, especially the tracks from the Beatles' second album, aren't slathered in reverb the way they were on the Beatles' second album.
Now, from your memory, how soon was it after I Want to Hold Your Hand that you started to hear other Beatles songs?
Okay, it was like within probably, let's see, She Loves You made WABC's survey the next week. Because I was February 7th, so the February 14th survey, She Loves You, was on, January 14th, I should say. Okay. She Loves You made the list, and in fact was in the top 5 within like 2 weeks. And then Please Please Me, and in fact, by the middle of January, Dan Ingram began playing at 5:00 every afternoon, would play the 3 Beatles records, because at that point, that's all there was, were the 3 singles. And so he would play I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Please Please Me, because VJ had just reissued Please Please Me. So he would play that for probably a couple of weeks. He would play those 3 songs at 5:00. And then they began, and this is where things start to get really interesting. They began adding the B-sides of those 3 singles. I Saw Her Standing There, I'll Get You, and From Me to You, because the reissue of Please Please Me, they had put From Me to You on the B-side instead of
Ask Me Why.
Ask Me Why. Thank you. I'm thinking There's a Place. That's and then MGM releases My Bonnie.
Right.
And so all of these were kind of like in the what they called hot prospects on their survey. And by the middle of February, first of all, by the middle of February, they had 3 of the top 4 songs. Now, this is, everybody points to April 4th and the Billboard issue with them having the top 5 singles and the top 2 albums. But in the middle of February, on both WABC and WMCA, the Beatles had the 3 of the top 4 singles. The only one that wasn't a Beatles record was Dawn Go Away by the Four Seasons. But down further on the chart, they began playing, not only were they playing the B-sides and and My Bonnie, but also they were playing album cuts.
Yep.
And top 40 stations did not play album cuts in those days at all. Never.
Right.
and although, of course, interestingly, all of the tracks that they played were from Meet the Beatles.
Okay.
Nothing from Introducing the Beatles. So you wonder if maybe Capitol had given them a little bit of inducement.
Uh-huh. So how was all this explained to a young Beatle fan, this barrage of music coming at them all at once? I mean, we know from history that all this music had already been recorded a year ago, what was on the Please Please Me album, Love Me Do, even earlier, but here it was, you're a young fan, radio's playing all these songs all at the same time. Was it explained at all that this was early in music? How was it presented?
No, it was just, they realized that there was this huge demand, especially by the time they came to New York, to do the Ed Sullivan Show. The appetite for Beatles music on top 40 radio was such that they were playing anything. They began playing Roll Over Beethoven from the Canadian, the Capital of Canada single.
Right.
And they began playing Twist and Shout, which had just been released by VJ on their Tolly subsidiary. I mean, anything. Although, like I said, interestingly, they didn't play anything from Introducing the Beatles, but they just played anything. And I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe I was resistant to change or whatever, but it just totally confused me. I thought, this is this group that, and all these girls at school are going crazy about this group that, nobody had heard of 2 weeks ago. And so I kind of resisted for quite a while there. Even the first Ed Sullivan Show didn't do it for me, but the second one did. And so I've always said that I think what made me so much of a fan was that they won me over. That there wasn't all the hype and so many records being basically pushed on us at once, that it was actually their performance that won me over.
So really, all that music that you heard prior to that second performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, that didn't wow you?
No, I really just, I guess it's just kind of me, like Seinfeld. I didn't start watching Seinfeld until probably about the third season. And the same thing with The Sopranos. Something that's like really new, for whatever reason, I'm kind of resistant to. And it just seemed that, like I said, all of this music was coming out of nowhere, because we didn't know anything about this group yet. And so I just kind of put up a wall of resistance.
When all these songs came out, I just remember as a kid buying the singles and the albums without questioning it, without questioning why is there so much coming out all at once, not being aware that a lot of this music was older. And if I myself was a teenager then, I would be questioning this. I'd be saying, why so much music? Why on different labels? What is this?
Yeah, exactly. It just, and like you say, because, in those days it was, the DJs were, just did their regular DJ patter. And they didn't really go to the point of like even Scott Muni didn't really go to the point of explaining why there was all this music all of a sudden. So
do you recall there being big wars between the two giants there, ABC and MCA?
Well, they definitely, when the Beatles hit New York, they were definitely in competition, because Scott Muni and Cousin Brucey were both at Kennedy Airport that afternoon.
Mm.
But B. Mitchell Reed, who was the nighttime guy on WMCA at that point, he was really more of a blues and jazz guy, and he later became like a pioneer of FM rock in L.A. on KMAT, and he kind of held the Beatles at kind of at arm's length. But Scott Muni and Cousin Brucey were there at Kennedy Airport. Of course, that was overshadowed by Murray the K and all of his showboating. And the funny thing is that, people, because of all that fifth Beatle nonsense and all that stuff, people, I think that that a lot of kids were listening to Wins. To WINS, which was Murray's station. And the fact is they weren't. Nobody, at least the people that were my age, and I was 14 at the time, and in my age group, nobody listened to Wins. That was kind of like the kids that were the older teenagers that were into doo-wop. Uh-huh. The ones whose favorite groups were the Four Seasons, Jay and the Americans, and the Duprees. They still were listening to Wins, but their ratings were cratering. And then within like a year, Murray would be either fired or left the station. And 2 months later, they went all news, the format they've had for 57 years. So it really was WABC and WMCA. And once the Beatles got to New York, there was a competition about having the Beatles do jingle intros and they did quite a few of them for WMCA and did a couple of them for ABC, which they used a lot over the next few years.
Wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. But the real competition really didn't start until a little bit later on, when the new singles began coming out. And generally it seemed as if Capitol would kind of alternate between the two stations as to which one would get the first and exclusive, which was why I think it was ABC who was the first one to begin dropping in on the record, you're hearing this first and exclusive on WABC, so that WMCA couldn't tape it.
Right.
And then began playing it.
Now, as a listener, which of those two stations did you prefer?
The problem was that in the case of both stations, they played commercials after every song. So it was like if you had like a transistor radio, you would basically wear out the dial, flipping between, since there was no digital stuff in those days, flipping the dial between the two to keep from, so that you'd have actually music to listen to all the time instead of having to sit through a couple of commercials after every song.
Right.
And the WMCA's their playlist was wider because they had actually, they called their survey the Fabulous 57 survey, and they had 57 songs on it. Whereas ABC probably played maybe 20 songs, 25 songs. Although they, obviously expanded that with all the Beatles material,
right?
But they, that was, it was, it really depended on, like I said, and also sometimes, which particular DJs were on. People had their particular favorites. Again, because first Scott Muni and then Cousin Brucey at night, and BMR on MCA, and he was kind of an acquired taste.
Yeah.
And in fact, actually, he ended up a year later going back to LA And that was where a couple of years later he would begin as a pioneering FM DJ. But and so then they reached out and brought Gary Stevens to New York. Mm-hmm. And I think the last time I checked, I think he's the last of the good guys that's still with us. Okay. Much in the way that Brucey is the last of the WABC DJs.
Yeah, it's funny. Obviously, me being 10 years younger than you, I wasn't analyzing radio then. You know, right. I wasn't saying, gee, there's too many commercials on this station, I'm not going to listen to it.
Yeah, right.
I was listening for the music. And in fact, even though it was much later on that I got into the DJs, it was only because of the music that I listened as a little kid. Mm-hmm. It was just amazing to me. You would turn the dial, you'd go from one Beatles song to another Beatles song at that time.
Sure.
But, I have great memories of Top 40, what was played on Top 40 during that year. And even before that, I still have some memories of music I liked before the Beatles. But sure. What were you into before the Beatles? Musically?
Well, it's funny because, there's this myth that it's grown up over the years, which I tried to kind of bust in the book that I wrote, Changing Times, that basically, the period from, depending on your viewpoint, either when Elvis went into the army or when Buddy Holly died in the plane crash, through, until the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand, was this 40 miles of bad road, which was nothing but, dance records and novelties and things like that. And that's completely wrong. When I began listening kind of seriously to rock and roll in 1961, there was, great R&B, especially the stuff out of New Orleans, Chris Kenner, Ernie K. Doe, things like that. The Gary U.S. Bonds records.
Okay.
The Cameo Parkway stuff, the Chubby Checker, Dee Dee Sharp, Bobby Rydell records, things like that. And then the Spector's records, although, obviously we didn't know at that point that it was, that they were records produced by Phil Spector. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know any of that until years later, but, all of those records by the Crystals and the Ronettes and Bobby Sox and the Blue Jeans and all. And the Four Seasons, yep. They were, especially, where I was living in New Jersey at that time, the Four Seasons were absolutely huge. Mm-hmm. And, even to the point where the Smirko character in I Want to Hold Your Hand is yelling at Murray about, how come you don't play the Four Seasons anymore? And so I was listening to a lot of different things.
Yeah, I was very much the same way, and I'm glad you're saying what you're saying, because I don't think it was a dull period.
Not at all, not in the least. 63 actually was a very good year. I'm ignoring the Beach Boys.
Yep.
And Jan and Dean and the other the other surf and hot rod records, including a couple of which were I remember thinking when Surfin' Bird came out by the Trashmen, this was certain to be a number one song. This was in December of 63. And of course it got into the top 10, and that was it, because then ba-boom.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Even though I was only 4 when I heard I Want to Hold Your Hand, I can remember hearing the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons and Bobby Darin and Rick Nelson hits, even though a lot of them were much earlier. And
sure.
I mentioned several times Peter, Paul, and Mary was big in my house. My mother loved them. Their In the Wind album I've played. I can't even tell you how many times I played that album. One of the most played albums in my history. So the folk music that was coming out there with Bob Dylan starting out, Joan Baez and all that.
In the fall of 63, in October, I think, Peter, Paul, and Mary had the top 2 albums in the country. with I think the first album and In the Wind.
Okay.
And that was considered almost unheard of for a folk music group to have the top two albums. And little knowing that, just a few months later, there'd be a rock group. And this is in an era when rock groups didn't really sell albums in large quantities, that a rock group would have the top two albums.
Okay. So going back to how that second appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show changed everything for you. From that on, were you just completely obsessed with this band?
Yeah, the next week I went over to Modell's Shoppers World, which was this big department store, which was across the street from where I lived at the time, and got the three singles. God, I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, and Please Please Me. Although I didn't get either of the first two albums until later on in the year. The first album that I got was actually the UA soundtrack of A Hard Day's Night, because this was in June, and they UA put the soundtrack out. Well, let's see, because I graduated from 8th grade in the second week in June. And I had some money that had been given to me for for graduation, and I happened to go into Modell's, I think like that Monday, and I see A Hard Day's Night, which they apparently, which, I mean, even though the sort of like the official release date that we know actually is not really that accurate, because I think they put it out as soon as possible, figuring as even United Artists, as the movie company figured, was that in a few months this is all going to be over. This group is going to be gone. So we better make our money now. So they put the soundtrack out. It was a month or more before the British album came out, and like 2 months before the movie.
Yeah.
So that was actually my first Beatles album.
Now, when the Beatles did occupy the top 5 singles on the Billboard charts, April 4th, 1964, and the top 2 albums, was there much made of that on the radio, or did these top 2 stations in New York just tell you what was on their survey? Did you know that?
Yeah. No, it wasn't until probably years later that I knew about that, because especially, because that was the first week in April, that would have been old news in New York, because like I said, in the middle of February, they were just as dominant on the two major top 40 stations. So no, there was I don't remember until much later seeing any reference to that.
Yeah, and nowadays every year they bring it up on the anniversary.
Oh yeah, every year people post. In fact, I've stopped doing it on Facebook only because it's like everybody does it every year.
Well, I like young fans to know about this.
Oh sure, absolutely.
Accomplishment. They not only had the top 5 singles, they had 12 singles on the Hot 100,
and the top 2 albums.
Yes, and then the following week, they had 14 songs.
Right.
They didn't have the top 5 anymore, but they had 14 songs on the charts.
Right. And there are people that now they bring up the fact that a couple of years ago Drake had like a whole bunch of songs in the upper echelon of the Hot 100, and there have been a couple of other times when rappers of one type or another have had a lot of songs from a particular album. It's completely different because the chart formulation is the chart formulation really changed completely probably 20 years ago. I forget the exact year, but it became computerized, a good 20 years ago. In fact, the software package that does most of the tabulations now is the one that replaced me at ASCAP. So, you can't compare. I mean, I guess probably the closest to replicating what the Beatles did was probably at the height of, Saturday Night Fever mania.
I was going to say
when the Bee Gees and Andy Gibb and I guess it was Samantha sang, Emotion, and it wasn't the top 5, but it was like I think 5 in the top 10, if I remember correctly. This is in July of '78.
Okay,
I'm pretty sure.
I don't remember if it was 5 of the top 10, but apart from the Beatles, the only other act that has impressed me with this kind of chart explosion are the Bee Gees. And it's similar in a way to the Beatles, because when I think about 1964, I'm also thinking about the other artists that John and Paul gave songs to, like Britain and Billy Kramer and those artists. And but the Bee Gees were beyond amazing, not only having their own hits, but writing for their brother Andy, like you said, Samantha sang, Yvonne Elliman,
right?
Later Dionne Warwick and Barbra Streisand, and Grease for Frankie Valli, and
right.
It was amazing, all the hits that they had pretty close in time, and not just for themselves, but how well they wrote for other people.
Exactly. It's I've always, because Bee Gees First, which came out in August of '67, is one of my all-time favorite albums. And I always, whenever I hear people say, "Oh, they were a disco group," they weren't a disco group at all. And so I always try to dispute that. And it's such a shame that they got caught up in the whole. And believe me, I was as much of a disco sucks, militant as anybody, but not when it came to the Bee Gees. I never considered them a disco group, and it's just too bad that they got caught up in the whole, disco sucks backlash in toward the end of '79 and then in '80.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because of the saturation of airplay of Bee Gees music, songs that they wrote for other people, which had a Bee Gees sound to it compositionally, there was a burnout factor, and nobody wanted to touch them for a long time after that.
Right, which didn't happen, by the way, with the Beatles. It's why I think nothing like what happened in the first half of '64 will ever happen again, because there's you can't have, especially now where everything is so fragmented. As big as, say, Taylor Swift is these days, there's still pretty much like a solid block of people who don't like her, because of the style of music that she does, that she's a pop singer instead of a rock singer, whatever. And that, that kind of thing didn't exist in '64, other than, the obvious, the adults thinking that this long-haired group, what are they doing? This is terrible music. And, but then what would happen is, when people would hear like easy listening versions, instrumental versions like this, like the Hollywood Strings versions of Beatles songs, they would suddenly, oh my God, those melodies, they're really good. Even I Want to Hold Your Hand has a lovely melody. And when like Petula Clark did a ballad version of it in '65, and the Hollywood Strings instrumental version of it, I mean, it's gorgeous.
Yeah. Beyond that, what the Beatles were doing back in in the 60s, they were changing so rapidly. There wasn't a chance to get bored.
Absolutely.
They weren't repeating themselves for too long. So I think that's part of the reason. But as you kind of explained, and you and I privately have griped about this, about how specialized radio has become.
Yes.
In the days of Top 40, even though the playlists were tight, you had so much variety there. And even if you take a look at 1964, you don't just have Beatles there and pop music. You've got Hello, Dolly making #1 from Louis Armstrong.
Which was the record that knocked them, that finally, knocked their hammerlock on the #1 spot in the first, 3 or 4 months of the year. That was the first record, of the year by anybody other than the Beatles to go to #1.
But you had pop, you had R&B, you had country, there's so many styles. And that's why I love Top 40 radio in the 60s and the 70s, especially.
Sure.
The fact that you could have so much going on at the same time and it all got played. And even though we're talking about 64, the example I always give, because I think that late 60s and early 70s, while I like a lot of decades, it's probably my favorite time in music for hits. But on WABC, you would have heard the Osmond Brothers, One Bad Apple, Whole Lot of Love from Led Zeppelin, Rose Garden from Lynn Anderson, and Superfly from Curtis Mayfield, all on the same station.
Exactly.
And I loved all of it.
Yeah.
So
and it was musical democracy.
Yeah.
Frank Sinatra had one of the biggest selling records of his career right in the middle of the British Invasion with Strangers in the Night, and then a year later had a #1 record with his daughter Nancy. Something Stupid is not that great a record, but it was a #1 song.
And that I've talked about how as artists get older, the stations that we used to call Top 40, now contemporary hit radio, will gradually phase out those artists no matter what. The fact that Sinatra in 1966, he would have been almost 50, right?
He had actually just turned 50 the previous December.
That would never happen now.
No. Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah.
There's no way. Absolutely no way. That's why, if people, when Paul McCartney puts out a new album, and I see people on, social media saying, "Oh yeah, there's such and such a song. Oh, that's going to be a certain hit." It's not, because Z100 in New York, they're not going to play a record by an 80-year-old,
right?
No matter who he is. So
if you put out Band on the Run right now, if it never came out before and it sounded exactly as it did in 1973, and he put it out now, it wouldn't be a hit, because they wouldn't touch someone that age. We just mentioned Louis Armstrong.
Yeah.
At the time when Hello, Dolly was a hit in 64, he was 64, I think. 63, 64.
Something like that, yeah.
Perry Como.
Yeah.
It's impossible. How old was he when that was a hit?
Exactly.
That would never happen today.
Yeah.
That's really sad.
It really is. And especially with Hello, Dolly, at that point, we kind of knew, because I remember, in the 50s, I can remember seeing Louis Armstrong on all the variety shows, and he was this very kind of ingratiating guy with the handkerchief and all that stuff. But we knew nothing about what a giant figure. I didn't know this until probably, I don't know, maybe the 80s or 90s of what a giant figure he is in the history of jazz.
Yep.
There are people who will tell you that he almost invented jazz as we know it. And yet at that point, he was just, a guy that was on variety shows and had this #1 song.
And had an incredible personality, which sometimes would overtake the talent part as a trumpet player.
Yeah.
But I realized you were a lot younger when this was going on, but could you even compare what it was like when Elvis Presley first burst out on the scene to when the Beatles did?
I have kind of vague memories of seeing his appearances on TV in 1956. Now I'm let's see, in 56, I turned 7 in August.
Right.
So, and so basically, I mean, all I knew, it was like talking about, Elvis the pelvis and, you ain't nothing but a hound dog. I mean, that was basically what I knew. I really didn't, I wasn't really conscious of, how big he had become, Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel were basically the biggest selling record to that point in time,
right,
in history, and the impact that his appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show had,
right,
and especially the last one when they showed him only from the from the waist up. No, I didn't really know much about that at all.
Okay.
But years later, obviously.
Yeah, I remember Don't Be Cruel and Hound Dog is, I think, to this day, the biggest double-sided hit of all time.
It could still be, because again, when the chart, it was number 1 for the longest period until the formulation for the charts changed in the early 90s. Because I think it was either like Boyz II Men or Whitney Houston that broke that record in the early 90s. Yeah.
I have to look that up, though.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, sometimes I wish that I could have been a lot older in 1964 to really absorb what was going on. And when those other records came out that I just mentioned before that the Beatles wrote for others, was it always mentioned on the air, Peter and Gordon, written by Lennon and McCartney, or did they become hits kind of without too much pushing the Beatles?
Well, actually, it was the success of like World Without Love that kind of taught us, what? Well, I mean, first of all, it was probably, the Beatles and the Beach Boys had kind of taught us to not only pay attention to the A side, but also the B sides. But it was the success of World Without Love that taught us, check out the writer's credits.
Right.
Because it was like word of mouth that suddenly said, hey, who wrote this song? It was John and Paul of the Beatles. And which was why when it finally kind of took off, it became a number 1 record. But probably if the writer's credit had not been on the single, it might not have been as successful.
But was there a lot mentioned on the radio about it being written by John and Paul? Really?
To an extent, it probably depended on who the DJ was, because there were some DJs who were more into the music, like Scott Muni was, like Dan Daniel was on WMCA, and Jack Spector, whereas somebody like Herb Oscar Anderson or even Harry Harrison and Joe O'Brien, they were kind of like, the music was just kind of like the tools of their trade. So they really didn't pay that much attention to it. But somebody like a Dan Daniel would have pointed out, that Lennon and McCartney wrote World Without Love, or wrote, Bad to Me.
Right. Was there any kind of news source that you could turn to in those days?
Nothing. There was no rock press of any kind in this country. Now, in England, of course, there were 4 weekly pop newspapers. So it was, so it was easy to find out what was going on there. But here, there was nothing. Basically, you had to find out any information, you really had to go to something like 16 magazine and have to, get through, Leslie Gore's top 10 tips for dating to get to any kind of information. Gloria Stavers, who was the editor of 16, did a column called Gigi's Gossip, which you would think on the at face value, you think, oh, it's probably just a stupid gossip column. But she would have these little tidbits about like albums, like folk albums that she would recommend. Like this new album with Joan Baez is really worth your attention.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the fall of '64, before Beatles 65 came out, she had a little nugget saying that, word is that the new Beatle album is going to have a lot of the cavern sound, which translated to they did a bunch of covers, that they used to do. So things like that. But that was the only way you could find out any information unless you subscribed to Beatles Monthly. And, not many people did that here in America.
Right.
So, it was just like really hardcore fans that really did that. Maybe members of the fan club, that sort of thing.
Since we were just talking about A World Without Love, if not much was mentioned on the radio about the association, then it really did well on the strength of the song itself.
Mm-hmm, sure. It did. I'm not sure if it would have been a number one record if it hadn't been for the fact that word of mouth suddenly started that that they had written that song. Not sure that it would have gone to number one, but it certainly helped.
Yeah.
And then from then on, I began looking at the to see not only who wrote the song, but also who produced it, because George Martin produced a lot of those records. He didn't produce the Peter and Gordon records, but certainly Billy J's records and Jerry and the Pacemakers and all.
Yeah. Very interesting. It's a fascinating part of the Beatles story is to know the songs they wrote for other people, they played on for other people, they produced for other people. I always thank Wally Podrazik and Eric Castleman for All Together Now, which led
absolutely
me to that. But yeah, since we mentioned A World Without Love, transition here. You want to say any words about Bobby Rydell, who also covered A World Without Love? Although when I spoke to him about it, and I did an interview on my channel here, I feel very fortunate that I did a year ago with him. He didn't look at it as a cover because they both really recorded it very close
at the same time. Yeah.
But it just so happens that Peter and Gordon's version caught on. And as Peter Asher told me, he and Gordon wanted to perform A World Without Love on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right.
But Bobby Rydell beat them to it.
Yeah.
It ended up they performed I Don't Want to See You Again months later because of Bobby. I don't even see the harm in the same song being done by two different artists on the show. But
oh yeah, I mean there were pop artists who would do this, especially pop, really well-known pop songs of the day. There'd be, 1 week, I don't know, Ella Fitzgerald would do a song, and then the next week, George Hamilton would do the same song.
Yeah. But any memories you want to share about Bobby Rydell?
Yeah, he was
so much more now than I ever have.
Yeah, he was, again, he's a good example of the, how, especially the teen idols of the early 60s got really kind of diminished by, especially a little later on when, rock criticism really began. They really lumped all of, as they call them, the Bobbies and the Frankies, and lumped them all into, just one pot. And that's not the case, because, like somebody like Bobby Darin was one of the most multifaceted talents, maybe in pop music history. And Bobby Rydell was pretty close to that, because he was certainly the most talented of the, as they call them, the bandstand boys, of him and Frankie Avalon and Fabian. And next was, you could throw Freddie Cannon in there as well. And but he was he was certainly the most talented of any of them. I mean, just the mere fact that he, just a few months before the Beatles broke, he was in Bye Bye Birdie.
Right.
And no, his hits from the early 60s, there's some great records in there.
Absolutely.
Like Swingin' School, Wild One, Kissin' Time, but my favorite and yours is the record that he actually had recorded like a year before in England, was written and produced by Tony Hatch, who later was Petula Clark's producer and writer.
Yeah.
And Forget Him was a very big hit in England in, I think it was the spring of '63. And then I remember in the fall of '63, he did an album of like hits of 1963, like his versions of actually using, I think, the same track of the Times version of Wonderful, Wonderful, things like that, So Much in Love, things like that. But tucked into the LP was this little 45 with like a message from Bobby on one side, and the other side was Forget Him. And he talked about, on the little message, he talked about the fact that he had recorded the song in England in, earlier in the year. And of course, when it came out in, I guess, October, November, whatever it was of '63, nobody knew that it was, that it would mean anything a few months later. But then when it was released as a single, it very well might have gone to number one, except that, again, it was right at the time. I mean, literally right at the moment that I Want to Hold Your Hand took off.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
Unfortunately, that was his last significant hit.
Last top 10 in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Paul actually said in the Beatles anthology that one of Bobby's songs influenced She Loves You. And I get a little bit confused about this because part of it has to do with saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And also the whole call and answer technique, which was used in like Swingin' School.
Right. I think it was really more the lyrics, that it was, that the lyrics of She Loves You are, about a guy basically telling, telling this other guy that this girl loves him, so, which is kind of like the flip side of the theme of Forget Him, which is a guy talking to this girl and telling him that, that forget him, I'm the one for you.
Right. But, in the Beatles anthology, Paul doesn't cite which song it was specifically. It was an influence. And so a lot of people theorize that We Got Love could be the song because he does say, yeah, yeah, yeah in it. And Swingin' School as
it's possible, but I have a feeling because of the lyrical the lyrical link that it's probably Forget Him.
Because Bobby has said that he thinks it was Forget Him that influenced.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
But, I have a little story just to give you about the kind of like the impact that the Beatles were having, even in '65. By that time I'm in ninth grade, and for lunch, a bunch of us, instead of dealing with what was served in the cafeteria, we used to go down to a luncheonette a couple of blocks away. So I'm just about to go down there at lunchtime, and I see a bunch of kids gathered around a radio. Now, this is like a year and a half after the assassination of President Kennedy. It's about 2.5 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Seeing a bunch of kids gathered around a radio, there's nothing good that can be coming of this. So I go over to one of the kids and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "WABC just premiered the new Beatles single, Ticket to Ride." So that gives you an idea of just how big an impact they were having with each new record.
Right. That's the kind of thing I miss.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say I was born too late, because I'm very happy with everything that I was exposed to in the 60s,
absolutely,
70s, and certainly the success of the solo careers as it was happening, which I can remember far more clearly than anything else. Sure. But sure. I envy those of you who can remember very well those events when a new song or a new album was premiered on the radio. I can only imagine what it must have been like when Sgt. Pepper was premiered. But
that was,
I'm sure all the other ones too, but that was, I guess, up to that point, the biggest moment.
Especially Sgt. Pepper, because of the fact that we had been waiting so long, because there had been 10 months between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, with only this incredible two-sided masterpiece, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, in between. And so the wait for it was excruciating. And I can remember by this time, Murray the K was on WOR-FM, which was the first in New York, the first FM rock radio station. And he apparently the promo copies of Sgt. Pepper arrived at I guess most radio stations the Monday before it was released, which was like at the very end of May. And so I got to hear the whole thing, because he played it. He didn't. He basically before each song he would kind of introduce what the next song was. Right. But I got to hear the whole album in context. But even then, it wasn't until I had the first actual listen to it, at home on that following Saturday, that I realized what an incredible experience it was.
Right. Well, you were very lucky.
Yes.
to be around times to remember that, because even though the experience of listening to the full album is different than what you hear on the radio, when you hear something for the first time, that's very special. So,
in fact, the first time that I heard "Hey Jude" was on my 19th birthday. This was in August of '68, and I remember Harry Harrison, who was just a few days away from moving from WMCA to WABC, premiered it. But it was the same morning that the Soviet Union rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the reforms there. So it was like the association of what was going on then, and the premiere of "Hey Jude" was kind of interesting. But that was also, hearing that for the first time was also pretty special.
Sure. And I'm hoping that I'm going to have you back more often to talk about radio memories.
Absolutely.
I'm going to be inviting other people as well if they want to hear their radio memories of growing up with the Beatles and going into the solo music too here on the show. Just wanted to say about Bobby Rydell, if you can, if you're not even familiar with his music, because of this wonderful thing called YouTube, check out what he's done before. I am amazed. I remember saying about Michael Jackson when he first burst out on the scene with the Jackson 5, how this little kid was ready for superstardom. It was like he'd been on stage his whole life. Bobby Rydell was a lot like that to me, because when he first emerged with Swingin' School and those early hits, Wild One, and he was only like 17, 18 years old. And he was so ready at that time. What a great voice, a very powerful voice. And even Frank Sinatra embraced him and even signed him to a record contract. And that takes a lot. If you have Frank Sinatra to endorse you, that's saying quite a lot. You must have thought quite highly of him. But
in the late 50s, Dick Clark did, along with American Bandstand, he did on Saturday night. He did a weekly show from New York that was sponsored by Beechnut Gum. So if you ever see it, you'll see a bunch of kids with buttons that say "IFIC," which was, I think they were like flavorific or something like that. But Bobby Rydell would appear frequently on that show. Yeah. And it was, you would have thought, the audience reaction, it was almost like the Beatles. Just amazing. And admittedly he was lip syncing because that was the deal on Dick Clark's shows. But still you could tell just his onstage magnetism and all. You could tell that this was not just some talentless teen idol.
Right. He also was very good at playing drums, which was his love at the very beginning. And there's some stuff you can find on YouTube with him playing. You should check out as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think for people who do the streaming thing and do either Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, there's a lot of his studio material on from Cameo Parkway on those sites that you might want to check out.
All right, anything you want to plug on what you've got cooking on for Beatlefan? We just lost your video there, Al.
Yeah, hang on. Am I back? There we are.
There you are.
Yeah, I'm just hanging up on a spam caller. Well, as a matter of fact, any day now, the new issue of Beatlefan should be in people's mailboxes. And I have a 40th anniversary piece in there about an album that your cohorts on Talk More Talk were discussing last week, Tug of War. And since this is, I guess, actually this week is its 40th anniversary.
Right.
And then the next issue, I have a 15th anniversary piece about Memory Almost Full.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
We could say what the album is, the 40th anniversary for Tug of War. And next things we said today, we're going to cover that. I did unfortunately have to miss that show on Talk More Talk. I actually, everybody in my family came down with COVID, don't mind telling. Right. And that was the only reason why I had to miss the show. I had no voice at that point. So it's kind of coming back now. A little struggle here. But
yes.
Yeah, so we'll be doing a show on Tug of War on the next things we said today. And yeah, looking forward to that. That album since it first came out, still do. And you also know our colleague Tom Frangione rates it as like the greatest album of all time. So
right, it's his favorite. Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking also like maybe the next time that we get together here, I want to, because you made a comment on this last edition of Things We Said Today that you listen more to radio now than you were even back in the the late 60s or in the 70s.
Right.
And I want to find out like what you listen to.
Well, the thing is, back in the 60s and 70s, I was listening really to the new music of that time, whereas now I have so many choices. And the ironic thing is that even though I live in Connecticut, I hardly listen to any Connecticut radio stations. I'm on the South Shore of Connecticut, and I pick up a lot of stations from Long Island. And one of the stations is a very famous station, WLNG, which for many years was the ultimate oldies channel. And they were known for playing music from the 50s, even through the current hits of today. not as much with the current stuff. And they would play the big hits and the deep cuts. They've since changed their format quite a bit. Bill Evans, who used to do the news on ABC television, bought the station. And it's a much more free-form station. They still play a lot of oldies, but they play all kinds of genres of music. They'll play country hits. They'll go deep into album cuts. They'll have a show on the weekend promoting new artists. I like that format a lot, although I love the old format because I love an oldie station that doesn't just play the big hits, that play songs that you don't hear as much, or deep cuts or songs that didn't chart very high. I'm very much into those kind of shows. I love shows where they'll play the top 10 hits in the US on a certain week and then tell you what the top 10 hits were in the UK the same week. And you can explore.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the channels that I listen to, especially on internet radio, do that. But WLNG is one of the stations I listen to. There's another station, WEHM, which is a AAA formatted station, very much like what WFUV is, the station that Darren DeVito was on. It's, I always forget this, album, alternative. It's basically a lot of the new artists of today that play music that sounds more like 60s, 70s classic rock, but for today with a contemporary feel, very melodic stuff. So I like to hear the new music that's out today. And so I get my taste of that. They do play a little bit of classic rock in there, not that much. That station plays quite a lot of the Beatles anthology stuff when it comes to the Beatles. That's interesting strange about them because they barely touch the archival box sets on the Beatles, but they're still playing the Beatles anthology stuff, like I'm Looking Through You or It's Only Love. I can't understand the format, but I still love it.
Yeah.
And, there's another station there that runs my syndicated show, Every Little Thing, and they're called The Breeze, and they would be classified more as a soft adult contemporary station. And they'll play oldies from the 60s on up, and it's a lot of stuff that is more softer. I don't really want to call it middle of the road, but they'll play that stuff that classic hits radio won't touch. Classic hits is more, oldie stations have become classic hit stations, and they used to play 60s on up and then 70s on up, and some of them don't even play 70s anymore, but they won't play the ballady stuff. They won't play Bread or the Carpenters. You know, there's some kind of, you know, what their criteria is to play stuff that's more up-tempo, more rocking, you know, unless it's such an ultimate classic like Your Song from Elton John. But The Breeze plays a lot of the stuff that gets neglected on those stations. And so I love it for that reason. I love ballads and I love soft stuff too. I'm very varied in my musical tastes. So when I'm in the car, I usually pick between those three radio stations, and there's always something that I feel like hearing. So I get a taste of oldies, soft rock, new rock. That's in the car. And then when I'm home, I try to check out some of the internet stations that carry Every Little Thing, because most of them are not like typical AM or FM stations. They're much more creative in what they're playing. You know, there's one station, Pop Gold Radio, and they're all oldies, but they're kind of like, they'll play the big hits and they'll go deep at times. And I like that. So I have a lot of choices there, and I just wish that I had the time to listen to every radio station.
Oh, sure.
My syndicated show, because I feel like I should know what they're doing. It's not that easy to have the time for that, especially when I'm doing all these different Beatles shows. But
exactly,
you know, I like to get a taste of all this kind of music. Sometimes there's nothing quite like hearing an oldie that you haven't heard for a long time. It's the greatest feeling in the world. Sometimes it's great to hear a deep cut that you haven't heard for a long time. And then when you hear a new artist, or a relatively new artist whose music you appreciate, that's a great feeling too. So I never get bored with radio. And then I've got all the podcast shows that there are to listen to.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then there's so many good ones that are out there. I just don't have the time for it all. And then it's not all on the Beatles too. So.
Oh, yeah. I try to listen to, there's a couple of podcasts that I listen to that deal in, you know, what's on the charts now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been listening, for a couple of years to NPR's All Songs Considered.
Okay.
But the problem is that now it's like it's pretty much dominated by millennials who are basically filling it up with reggaeton and ambient music and stuff that is just so far out of the mainstream that it doesn't really give me a taste of what's out there. But there's a couple of there's a podcast called Switched on Pop, and then there's the one that the New York Times does called their Popcast, which John Caramonica, who is one of their main pop music critics, does. But it's a struggle sometimes with those because let's face it, the what's out there right now, what's on the charts right now, is being aimed at people who are 3 times younger than me.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's, so it's obviously, that kind of stuff is obviously not, it doesn't speak to me.
Right. But there are those stations, like I said, the AAA stations, which I think you probably would appreciate more than any other format if you listen to WFUV or if you listen to WEHM on Long Island. So I would recommend that to anybody who still wants to find something to appreciate that's out there that's new, but you want it to be closer in style to 60s, 70s, and even 80s music. Still melodic music, still harmony every now and then.
Right.
I'm not claiming to be this big expert on new music, but there are bands that have been around for 20, 30 years now, like Wilco or Death Cab for Cutie. I mean, they've built up audiences all these years, and they deserve all the success that they've had because they've worked at it for so long, and they're really good at what they do.
Yeah, I have
those bands.
I have Sirius XM, and there's one particular channel that I have to check out that Sean Ross mentioned when he was on with you a couple of weeks ago, and that's one called The Spectrum.
Okay.
I need to check, because most of what I've been listening to there, besides the obvious, the Beatles channel, is one called The Blend and one called The Bridge, which play a lot of I guess the Blend is sort of like your sort of your basic light FM type of material, and The Bridge is sort of like sort of light classic rock, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. As long as what bores me are the radio stations that are oldies or classic hits or classic rock, and it's the same thing. Or if you're 500, and I don't know how anybody can put up with that. If you love listening to music on a daily basis, I don't want to hear the same songs all the time. So
you would go crazy about this. Where I live in Pittsburgh now, or just outside of Pittsburgh, and the main classic rock station here is WDVE, which started out as a regular AOR. Well, not even AOR. It was before AOR. As a free form rock station 50 years ago, and just recently they're now an iHeart radio station.
Okay.
And they just recently moved their whole operation, and they had a contest late last year where they basically gave away their entire music library. So everything they now play is digital, and it's basically iHeartRadio approved digital. So basically, if they're going to play something by the Beatles, it's Revolution and nothing else.
It's usually
if they're going to play.
Usually Come Together is the most played Beatles song on classic rock radio.
Yeah, but DVE is a little harder edged
Okay.
than say Q104 in New York. And if it's like a Jimi Hendrix song, it'll be probably All on the Watchtower, something like that. So in other words, there's their playlist is now even smaller than most classic rock stations. And of course, it's the same features, they all request, lunch and the workforce blocks and the same stuff that every classic rock station does.
Right.
But that's terrestrial radio now.
Well, like I said, look on my website to all the stations that carry my radio.
Yeah.
And those are different types of radio stations.
Yes.
If you like more freedom on the air and you want to go deeper into an artist's catalog, nothing wrong with hearing the hits, nothing wrong with
sure.
These people would put them on the map in the first place. But if you think there are certain artists that deserve better treatment than that, and for years, we've talked about classic rock, you and I, how for the longest time, they'll never play anything that's pre-1967, unless there's a specialty program like a Beatles show on the weekend.
They may play like a Rolling Stone.
Okay.
And Satisfaction. They'll play Satisfaction. That's it.
But I have a lot of difficulty understanding that. I know what a pivotal year 1967 was, but is that big a difference whether you think it's contemporary sounding or not, which still doesn't even matter at all to me. I only care whether or not I like the song or not. But is there that big a difference if I'm going to hear a song from Revolver or Sgt. Pepper? No.
No.
It's not like I'm going to say, I don't want to hear Revolver now. It's
really.
not like everything started in 1967. And even then, they do play from 67 through 69 is less and less and less,
Yes.
So it's really a shame what's happened there. And then a lot of classic rock is playing less 70s. So
it's now especially like Q104 in New York. It's it's basically it's all it's U2, it's Van Halen, it's the Phil Collins Genesis, it's Nirvana, Pearl Jam, a lot of early 90s, Seattle grunge stuff. Nothing wrong with that, but still,
But don't forget all the other stuff that preceded.
Yeah, right.
It's really a shame, but there is a lot of interesting programming that's out there.
Yeah,
it's come down to whether or not you've got the time, or you really want to try to find out where it is. It takes a lot of work to find out where those stations are. So
that's the problem. It's not like it was, in the 70s when you could put on, a WNEW-FM or PLJ, and you would hear, especially on stations where the personalities, pick the music. They would, they could, kind of point you to a Bruce Springsteen or to, or an Elvis Costello and say, this is worth your attention. There's nobody, especially when most stations now of that type are voice tracked. So, I'm sure Darren can tell you plenty about that.
Well, we'll have him right here on the channel to talk about that more along with you.
Okay, that'll be great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those shows when we do more talk about radio here. But,
absolutely.
This has been great having you on, and we'll be seeing you quite frequently on the
I'm sure.
Here. And thanks to sharing all your memories of 1960.
My pleasure.
And we'll have you on very soon. And I want to thank everybody for watching the show. And as always, if you haven't done so, please subscribe to the channel. Tell as many Beatle fans as you can about this channel. Get my subscriptions up there. Would like to get to 1,000 pretty soon. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.